Welcome to Awesomeness with the JAMStack. Unfortunately, something went wrong with the recording of yesterday's session and the first part of the talk got deleted. That's why you're seeing me from home right now, as I fill in the part that's missing. After a while, we'll switch back to the live recording. Now, let's get started. So, my name is Kooij, age 32. I'm married to Irma and father of Otto. And my hobbies are drumming, game developing and volleyball. Now, we're here to talk about the JAMStack, but we'll start off with who I am and a small history of how I started, web development and internet stuff as a whole. Then I'll briefly explain what the JAMStack even is. Then we'll look into a real-world example of how you could use the JAMStack to build something awesome. And then we'll see how the JAMStack can be used in real-world usages, like for example enterprise or even startup type of situations. And then there's room for some feedback, questions and discussion. So, who am I and why does it even matter? So, to be fair, it doesn't really matter, but I will take you through a brief history of my existence on the internet. And the relevance of this is that the evolution of the modern internet and how its current state came to be kind of leads us to the JAMStack and the role it plays in the current landscape. So let's dive in. So here you see me at around 10 years old, which is roughly 20 something years ago. And this is a few years before the new millennium kicked in. And at this point in time, mobile phones were all the hype in technology land. And I in fact was so obsessed with them that I started a car wash company with the sole mission to buy me a mobile phone. Now, being a computer geek, I thought it was mandatory for me to make a website for this business as well. And this is actually where my epoch on of the existence on the internet for me started, because I published my first website and that's where my first history was recorded. In fact, if you look it up in the Wayback Machine or the Internet Archive or whatever you want to call it, you can still find the exact website as it was back then, apart from a few missing nice photos of cars. Now I was able to create this website using something called Front Page Express. For the people that don't know Front Page Express, imagine Microsoft Word, right? Like 20 years ago. And if you try and put images in it, they fly all over the place. Now imagine Microsoft Word 20 years ago had a little retarded brother. This was of course Front Page Express. So needless to say, I quickly ran into the limits of what was possible without going into the code. So this is exactly how I got started with programming. Now, code at this time looked something like this. CSS wasn't really a thing yet, at least not to me. And if you wanted to say change the font size of your typing, you just adjust the number 7 you see here into a different number. 7 at the time was the largest text could be. So if you change it, for example, to 3, the text size would change. But this didn't really provide much in terms of interactivity on your website. So this is where JavaScript came into place. Now JavaScript at this time and age, it was in a very different state than it is right now. At the time, there was something going on we called the browser wars. And at the time, Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator were two of the big players among a few others. And they all handled the interpretation of JavaScript and CSS very differently, which ended up making coding in JavaScript very difficult, because you had to take into account the different ways the different browsers would interpret your scripting. So what you see here is an actual example of about 20 lines of code, which just provide you with the ability of making something happen when you click on a button. Now, because this was not very intuitive, solutions quickly appeared. So things like jQuery and frameworks similar to jQuery quickly appeared that made it a little bit more manageable to create JavaScript. And the same code you saw before, it does exactly the same as these 3 lines you see here. So this made it a little bit better to create something interactable, but it wasn't ideal yet. And HTML and JavaScript at the time, they didn't provide any solution for storing data. So if you wanted to do something with the data users put in, you had to quickly go to a different type of language. In my case, I chose PHP and MySQL to handle this sort of stuff. And what you see here is a little bit of example code I found on the web on how in PHP 4 eras you'd make a guest book. And guest books were all the rage back then. If you didn't have a guest book on your site, you might as well not have a site at all. But this led to various problems of its own. Things like SQL injection through URL parameters and all sort of funky hacking stuff. And this led to building guest books all the time, all over. Because each time I'd build a new website, I'd also build a new guest book. Because I'd start all over trying to prevent the mistakes I made last time and, making it a little bit better this time. So I built dozens of guest books through my time. So this takes care of, interaction on your own website, but what about interaction with other websites? Now, as far as I can remember, this wasn't really a thing that was apparent for me, at least at the time. But in secret, it was happening already in some sort of way. And mostly in this type of form. Visitor counters really were a massive thing back then. And they are basically the birth of what we now call SaaS, or software as a service. Specialized little services that provide one function for your website and make it accessible, in this case through a JavaScript snippet. But in today's world, we mostly see these exposed through APIs. So that's a brief history of how I got into internet and web development stuff. So how does this equate to things like JAMStack? And more importantly, what even is this JAMStack? So we'll talk about JAMStack first. Now, JavaScript, APIs, and markup is actually what JAMStack stands for. And this is the part actually of the talk where people that are not that tech oriented may doze off a little bit. But please bear with me. Now, JavaScript, as I mentioned before, used to be used for mostly just enhancing the experience you have on a website. But in today's ecosystem, JavaScript plays a much larger role. Nowadays, it's used as a build tool. It's used to still enhance the experience, but it's also used as a backend tool for, say, static site generators. Now, static site generators play a large role in the JAMStack concept. We'll get to that in a little bit. But it also brings us the modern frameworks like Angular, Vue, React, which are both front-end component-based frameworks, but that also have tie-ins with back-end type of constructions. Now, this is not exactly the focus of this talk, so we'll briefly skip over the more advanced topics, but keep in mind that JavaScript plays a major role today throughout the entire ecosystem of the internet. Next up is APIs, and in terms of JAMStack, they have two applications. One is to connect through a set of APIs to third-party services, like, for example, Algolia or Contentful, software as a services type of companies that expose functionality over APIs. And the second use that you see in terms of JAMStack is connecting to microservices or small functions within your own architecture. And basically the APIs are a gateway of transferring data from your front page to whatever services lie beneath it. And finally there's markup, and specifically static markup. Now, back in the day when I used to make guest books with PHP, the markup would be generated dynamically through these interpreted languages like PHP or maybe even some sort of fancy Java application. But nowadays, when it comes to JAMStack, static HTML is all the rage, and I'll explain why this is important in a little bit. So you might be wondering, what's actually new with this concept? JavaScript, APIs, markup, these things have been around for as long as the internet has existed. Now there's a couple of concepts that fundamentally changed the way we use and retrieve the internet as a whole, basically. And one of those things really is, well, cloud. It's a horrible buzzword at the moment. Everything's cloud. I mean, your working environment is cloud, your banking, everything is cloud. But, you know, cloud is a very ambiguous term, and I'll try to explain what I mean with cloud when I talk about the JAMStack. Now, before, when you would visit a website, the website would be hosted at some server somewhere in the world. So if I were in the Netherlands and I'd visit a website that was hosted in, say, somewhere in America, the data from that website would have to be transferred halfway around the world, which would cause a significant delay, causing slow loading times. Now, to combat this, what cloud does for you is basically take a copy of your website and place it on servers all around the world, so that when I try to visit a website from the Netherlands, I'd visit this website through a server that's actually very close to me. This would lead to much faster loading times and much higher availability of websites, which is a very important part of the JAMStack philosophy. Now, this is actually where the static HTML comes into place as well, but because it is just static files, which are basically text files, these servers can be very simple and therefore very cheap. So this is why replication all over the world is possible. And it brings another advantage because it's just dumb HTML files, they don't have to store state or anything like that. So if one server fails for some reason, you can just switch to another one without it being causing any trouble. So that's a major advantage of using static HTML over anything dynamic, because it makes this type of concepts possible. Now, this is actually where the live recording started again, so we're gonna switch over to that.
Another thing that has really drastically changed through my history of the internet is the ecosystem of services or available APIs to the public. Here you see a small image I borrowed from Redpoint, where a lot of small companies they're not necessarily small companies, but they play a very specific role in the whole ecosystem of a JAMStack type of operation. And this is something that wasn't there when the internet started becoming a big thing. And this is really a significant change, because these smaller and specialized services make rebuilding a guest book, for example, a thing of the past, because building a guest book is no longer viable because it's expensive to build something. And if it's been done numerous of times before, it's probably cheaper to buy it as a service, because many people are using it and are already paying a small amount for it, which makes the whole cost spread through a much larger group of people, which makes all sorts of services that for different companies used to be much too expensive, but are now available in general and fairly cheap. For example, Algolia is a search company that provides Google-like intelligent search, or whatever you want to call it, and it's very cheap. Most of these companies have some sort of free tier that you can use to experiment with these services, and they're just mostly very good at what they do. And the problem you face as a developer has much more shifted towards finding the right tools that are already in existence and combining them, rather than building these tools yourself. Of course, if you work at one of these companies, it's a different story, but in a general manner of speaking, a lot of things you used to build yourself are now already there. You just have to connect with them through a set of APIs. So that's a significant change. And finally, the browser war that I mentioned before, it has changed it has changed pace at least. There's still a relatively large variety of browsers out there, but they have a lot of similarities in terms of the actual core that interprets the HTML, JavaScript, and the markup. CSS. And the main difference here is that writing JavaScript no longer is necessarily a big pain while being able to accommodate different browsers, because most of the browsers that you see are WebKit based or Gecko based, or there's of course some variants still available out there, but they have really grown closer together because lots of internet standards have emerged over time, which has made development much more accessible for everyone, basically. So to conclude, what is a JAMStack? Is it really something new? Meh, not really. What does matter, and what I think is the most important point of this, is that you start seeing these things together and start seeing the potential that these tools can bring you. This is how far the explanation of the JAMStack in general, from a technical point of view, will go. If you weren't interested because you're not tech savvy, this is your moment to wake up, because now we're going to get into the less technical stuff. And it mainly focuses on, all right, so JAMStack, sure, it's a thing, but what can you do with it, and why should you even use it in the first place? Well, I'd say let's entrepreneur, because what the things I like most is finding a concept and seeing how far I can take it within a small area of time. And that's exactly what I did recently using the JAMStack. And it started with a concept called developer bootcamps. It's something that you see a lot these days. People lose jobs due to various reasons. COVID, of course, but throughout time, I don't know, people lose their jobs and they think, okay, so there's a lot of work in this technology sector. Maybe I can change directions and become a programmer as well. So a lot of these developer bootcamps start to pop up, and therefore the developer community grew a lot. And I thought, there's something here worth exploring, and how can I use the JAMStack to, maybe chip in a little bit on this trend. So what I thought is, okay, I'm a software developer. I'm somewhat of an entrepreneur, or at least a hobby type of explorer. How can I cut out the hard work and still be able to profit out of this awesome concept? So I thought to myself, okay, there's something here with certificates. Giving out certificates because someone completed some sort of course or boot camp or whatever it is that you do. But this would of course involve teaching something and actually spreading some knowledge. This is of course much too much work for me. I needed to simplify the concept. So I thought to myself, all right, I'll just sell certificates that tell you that you're awesome. That's it. So let's look at how I did that. So first of all, I saw this LinkedIn type of thing, and I thought, all right, if you have my certificate, if you buy it, I want you to be able to show it on your LinkedIn page that you're awesome. So I looked up, how do you get your certificate to emerge on your LinkedIn profile? And this turned out to be much simpler than I thought. In terms of code, this is pretty much all you need. If you have an HTML page that says it's a certificate, it is. And it's, from a technological point of view, it's manageable. This is actually very similar to the HTML I showed that I used 20 years ago. It's very straightforward. Anyone can learn this stuff. So it's very suited for an operation like this. Now, getting this HTML somewhere on the web, it's not difficult. Anyone can do it. You can Google that stuff. I don't have to teach you. It's so simple, anyone can do it. But how do you get it to show up on your LinkedIn page? Well, there's another step you have to do. If you have a LinkedIn account, you just need to click on the work thingy in the top right of your screen, and then click create a company page. You'll fill out some form where you invent your company. In my case, this was the Institute of Awesomeness, which of course hands out these certificates of awesomeness. I put up some nice logo, and that's it. If you now click on add a certificate, you can add my certificates to your LinkedIn profile. But of course, this is not good enough yet. This isn't JAMStack. This is just being lazy. So I had to step it up just a little bit more. And this is the architecture that I finally came up with, which I'll now walk you through step by step, explaining how this adds to the whole. Because I thought having a certificate on LinkedIn alone, it's not enough. I want something tangible. I want to have a certificate to hang on my wall. So I started with the HTML file I just showed you. It's very simple. Of course, the example here is a little bit simplified, but it's very similar to what I just showed you. And what I did, I put my HTML file in a static site generator. Again, this is a relatively simple toolkit of JavaScript that allows you to transform your HTML through templating engines and allow you to upload it through services like Netlify or what have you. And being a developer, a software developer, I of course put this stuff under version control so that at a later point I could, well, version control is a different topic, but I put it under version control in a free tool called GitLab, which you may or may not be familiar with. Very similar to GitHub. And next I created a Netlify account. For those of you that are unaware of Netlify, Netlify is a cloud hosting provider that mainly just focuses on hosting static websites. So if you have a bunch of HTML files, you can put them on Netlify. Netlify does all the cloud stuff, the magic. But if you visit a website on Netlify, there's automatically some server near you that has this HTML file for you and serves it to you very fast, very easy. But this actually takes only a few clicks of allowing Netlify to access your GitLab account, and it magically works. Next up, I wanted to, it needed to be visual. It needed to be something that I could see and touch and feel. So I designed this simple little certificate. And it says in the middle, your name here. This is actually quite literally the file that I use to generate the certificates, but more on that later. So I designed this. Again, I'm a programmer, a developer, not a designer. And now I needed to put this image somewhere. So what I did is I created a Lambda function. Now this sounds fancy, but it's not actually. It's a Lambda function basically is a small piece of code that you put on a cloud environment. And when you call the cloud environment and say, hey, I want to run that Lambda function, it spins up some sort of server somewhere. You don't have to know how it works because it just does all these things for you. And it runs your code. And when it's done, the server is taken away again. No need to think about server management, hosting, all this stuff. It's taken care of. Netlify takes care of this. There's numerous of other vendors that have very similar way of operating. But this way, I was able to write very small and contained pieces of code that did simple functions. In this instance, I wrote a small piece of JavaScript that took my existing picture, uploaded it to Cloudinary, then changed the part that said your name here to your actual name. And there, your certificate is now stored in the cloud. That's fantastic, but it's still not tangible because I can't hold it in my actual hands. So the next thing I did is I looked for a kind of a drop shipping API. That's a whole nother concept in its own, but it's simply put, drop shipping means that you sell certain products, but you don't have the actual inventory yourself, another company takes care of this for you. So a dropshipping company exposes an API where you can say, hey, I want X amount of product shipped to this address. Just do it. And in that way, I don't have to manually print out the certificate, put it in an envelope and send it to someone. This company does this for me. All I do is create a Lambda function. And when someone clicks order a certificate, this piece of code is run and it sends the order out to an API. In this case, I used print API, which I looked up. It's a company in Groningen, and it's just a printing shop, print copy shop or something, and they have an API. And when you call it, they print whatever image you send to them. And this is the actual JSON code that you send to this service. Now, this may look somewhat intimidating, maybe, but it's just an email address, the product you want, and where do you want to ship it to. In this particular example, to the Osloweg in Groningen. And what this API does is it retrieves the picture from Cloudinary and it prints it, and they stuff it in some sort of box. And a couple days later, this arrives. This is one of the actual certificates that I ordered through my own service to prove that it works. And now everyone in the world can get certified. Awesome. So that's fantastic, of course, in itself, but it proves the power of this JAMStack type of thing. It's so simple that if you have an idea and you combine the right type of services that are already out there, you can very quickly prototype if your business idea is even valuable at all. Because this whole experiment that I built, I did it in a time span of a week. Of course, this is just a fun example, but it's a very short amount of time to invest to check whether your idea is worth pursuing, whether your company is worth pursuing, whether your business idea is valid. So that's, I think, a vast improvement over compared to 20 years ago. So that's all very nice stuff, but no one needs, well, of course, you guys really do need a certificate of awesomeness, but in the real world, this, of course, is just an example. So how would you use this JAMStack type of technology? And in what situations could it be of value? Well, there's a couple different situations where this can prove very valuable. The first is, and I already briefly mentioned it, it's validating business ideas. So if you have a concept, you want to try out a new business venture, this is very well suited to try out something fast, get actual real world examples, and get real world feedback from customers very quickly. And you'll see that if the certificates don't sell by the thousands in a month or two, which I expect, of course, it will, but it might not. You know, the amount of time I invested in this is very little, so I can start something different within a week. And that makes it very quick to iterate over business ideas or business proposals and see which one actually works. So that's something I think in the real world is a very, very valuable tool to have. But there's also a much more enterprise-oriented way of using the JAMStack, I think. And it's something that you see already a lot of larger organizations doing. And it has everything to do with the whole service-oriented architecture, microservice-oriented architecture, the whole decoupling of monoliths, which is really something that's going on globally at the moment. Headless is a similar term. Mach gets used. These are all pointing to the same principles of separating of concerns, if you will. It's a phrase that's been around as well for a longer time, but I think the core of the utility here is that separating your front end and your back end even more into specific services that have a very specialized reason of being, I think this is very valuable to have at your disposal. And all the benefits that I explained earlier have a similar great advantage if put to a larger scale. The hosting solutions that can be very expensive for larger monoliths, you can really save down on the costs of that if you transform parts of your business to JAMStack type of microservices or specialized applications. So I think for enterprise, this is also something that can prove very valuable and very much a time set and therefore money saving concept. Of course, it's not the solution for everything. I think it's good to have something like this in your toolkit as a full stack web developer, whatever fancy name you give yourself. And I guess that means there's only one thing left to do now, and that is get certified, because I know very sure that all of you are awesome. You just need some proof to back it up. And this certificate just does just that. So get yourself a certificate. And thank you very much for listening. I think now is the time to answer some questions if there are any. Wait, I'll see if I can open the chat here somewhere. Yeah, you can actually unmute yourself if you have a question. We'll see how that goes. While I'm doing, while you look for questions, I try to find the chat. But feel free to just barge in with your question.
Well, I think Tristan has a question. First of all, he said congrats. Where did you store the reference of the generated image of the print API?
That's actually a very good question.
Oh, Tristan is already is unmuted. So yes, Tristan, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. So I really wanted to know where did you store the reference of the generated image so that print API can retrieve it, because you did not show it on your graph.
Yes, thank you. Excellent question. The answer actually lies within the question, because I send the reference to the image to this print API and they store it. So I don't actually store it, but the reference that's there actually points to a point on in their API. So basically they have a order history API, which I use to retrieve the actual reference to the image. Does that answer your question?
Not really, but okay. But I mean, what if you generated your image, but you did not send the reference to the print API immediately after you have generated it? You see? I mean, if you don't do it in at the same time, in the same flow.
Oh, but I actually do.
Ah, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
your example
in the architecture, it kind of said that these things happen in parallel, but they actually happen in series. But just for the clarity of the image, it was easier to show it like this. But actually, what happens is the image gets generated, it comes back to the starting point with the reference, and then it gets sent to the print API.
Okay. I have another question, but there's another one on the chat, so
Great. I still haven't found the chat, but I can see the chat is over there, but I can't read it from here. So. Rinaldo, I heard you had a question that said something along the lines of, what does my JAMStack have to do with the jamstack.org JAMStack? Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
It's the same thing, actually. In fact, jamstack.org I think is a website that's created by the people of Netlify. Again, I didn't invent the JAMStack. I'm just here to explain about it and talk about it and explain what I did with it. I didn't invent it. So yeah, the jamstack.org website is actually the website of the people that did create the JAMStack. It's mostly people from Netlify. They are the actual founders of the brand name JAMStack or whatever. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, but do they add some additional features to all the tools that are connected? Or because what you showed is basically you connected the different tools, let's say, as you please. So while there, what do they add by adding a website specifically on that?
They don't necessarily add to the system by having this website. This website, I think its main goal of existence, the reason it's there is to advocate the existence of this concept. And they really think that moving from traditional monolithic type of architectures to something more jamstacky, or at least statically generated type of static HTML websites, they just made this website to advocate the fact that this is a thing and they think it's a good idea. So I guess, and again, I'm not affiliated with this website whatsoever, so I don't really know, but.
It's okay, thank you.
All right. Any more questions?
Yeah, it's Tristan again. I have another question. In the context of an e-commerce website,
right,
what kind of stack would you use to avoid vendor lock-in and framework lock-in? Because this is a really, because there's so many frameworks out there, Next, a lot of front-end frameworks. So it's really difficult to choose. So I want to have your point of view on that.
Right. So you're asking how can I avoid vendor lock-in by using a JAMStack approach on e-commerce specifically? Yeah. Right. So what I think is a good idea is to use any sort of e-commerce backend type system you like that provides APIs that are approachable in a transparent way. For example, there's BigCommerce or even Magento, I think, has headless capabilities. It doesn't really matter as long as you pick one. And the way of avoiding, I think, vendor lock-in in this situation is no different than any other situation where you have an API connection between the two. If you make a contract of how you use and use these APIs, I think you can always replace one piece of software with another, but how easily that's actually done in practice, well, it's never really easy. But I think this type of problem occurs not just with e-commerce. I think it's similar to all sorts of industries. Same goes for example, content management systems. The way you retrieve these content or shopping carts or products doesn't really matter. It's just data interaction between two different systems. So as long as you have your contracts in order and know what kind of information is sent back and forth, I think all the components in the individual JAMStack are replaceable and therefore allow you to prevent actual vendor lock-in. But again, within these small components of the JAMStack, say for example your front end, if you've chosen to go with Nuxt or Vue.js or Preact or whatever stack you chose, yeah, replacing that, there is no easy answer. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes, as a question. You mentioned that JAMStack is very good for prototyping business ideas. Do you think it still works well when the business scales up, or would you move to a different architecture?
I don't know if everyone heard, but I'll repeat the question. Chris asks, you mentioned JAMStack is very suited for prototyping pieces of software. trying out new business ideas. How well does this type of architecture scale? And if it doesn't scale, what type of architecture would you maybe suggest otherwise? Well, the simple answer actually is, I think it scales very well, because every business, every portion of business logic, ideally you try to compartmentalize into separate services. So if your business scales, all the components scale as well. So I think the real challenge in scaling up a JAMStack type of architecture lies within the individual components and making sure that one component doesn't have too many responsibilities. But I think this kind of diverges from the actual concept of the JAMStack itself, and really focuses more on architectural setup in a broader perspective. So does that answer your question, or did you mean something a little bit different?
Thanks.
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. That's actually a very good question, because as you could, if you paid close attention to the architecture, there is no actual reporting tool in place. So, at the moment, I have no idea, but I could look into the logs of the APIs and see how many people actually got a certificate. I have no idea. I know of one confirmed sale from someone other than me, but apart from that, I have no idea.
Laughing face emoji.
Smiley, smiley. Right. Any more questions? Someone actively typing. I think this about does it for today. Of course, if at any time you have more questions or feel like discussing these type of concepts with me, I'm available on all sorts of media like LinkedIn or I don't know, Twitter, if that's your preference. One more question.
Yes, from Jonathan, would you say using Drupal as a CMS is outdated in 2021? I work at a startup as a front-end developer, and I've suggested that we should switch to possibly Contentful, Strapi, etc.
Right. So
a more modern framework, Vue, React for
right. So I'll repeat the question for those that didn't hear. The question was, I work at a startup. Here we have a Drupal setup. And do you suggest switching over to a more JAMStack type of approach is a good idea for us? Well, of course, as an advocate for this concept, I have to say, yes, of course, you always have to switch to JAMStack. But I think the honest answer is, it depends on the startup. If what you have is working and it's secure and it scales, why change it? Because if it works for your business, for whatever goal you're achieving, great. No need to change it up just for the sake of technology. I think technology should always serve the purpose of the company you're using technology for, rather than the other way around. So if your company is doing something with Drupal, it works, fine. But if you maybe have trouble finding Drupal developers because, I don't know, for some reason, then maybe you could consider, if you're changing your architecture anyway, then maybe consider trying a more JAMStack type of approach. But I wouldn't necessarily change it just because. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Great. I guess we'll call it a night then. And thank you all for listening and watching. And maybe we'll meet again sometime in person next time.
I was going to say the same, Jens. Thanks all for your time and attention, of course. And Jens, for giving us an insight in JAMStack. For the people at home watching, hopefully you've learned or heard some new things you can get your hands in. I saw a lot of familiar names, but for the newbies, we organize these TechNights monthly. So February, the 24th to be precise, we have our upcoming TechNight about Azure DevOps and how to automatically generate release notes. Yeah, that's about it. So this TechNight will be published on our meetup probably tomorrow. So hopefully we'll see you yeah, on our next event. So have a nice evening. Thanks again, and see you next time.